Kung Fu Panda 2 is an amazing movie, one of my favorites of all time even. It's quite literally the perfect sequel and answers everything the first couldn't get to, and more. I mean, this movie has Shen, who's pretty much a perfect villain. So to hear that Kung Fu Panda 2 got a movie tie-in game wasn't too surprising considering its release era, but I was curious as to how it would work considering the sequel is a lot more story-driven than even the first movie, not to mention that the first movie was let off with one of the best movie tie-in games ever. So could this be a similar case, if not better? Let's find out. But before we find out, I just want to give a quick thank you to 10min Gameplay for allowing me to use your gameplay for this video. As for some reason, capture cards don't work with my PS3 because of HDCP, or whatever sad excuse Sony wants to give me for not wanting me to upload bangers like this one. So until I get an HDMI splitter, 10min Gameplay is responsible for this video even being possible at all. So huge credits to him will be in the description. Big thank you. Now on to the video. The Kung Fu Panda 2 video game was developed by Kryptonite Games, who are not at all responsible for the first movie tie-in game, which is already a bad look if I'm being honest. But who am I to talk? They made Wheel of Fortune on the DS, so obviously they must know something that I don't. Like most movie tie-in games, this released roughly 2 days before the movie, on May 24th, 2011. Unlike most movie tie-in games, however, each and every version of this game plays completely different, despite relatively being the same at its core. The Wii version utilizes a U-Draw tablet, the Xbox 360 version exclusively uses a Kinect, and the DS version is just, well, the DS version, probably your typical D-make if I'm being honest. This leaves the PlayStation 3 version as the only normal way to play the game, which is the one I'm going to be taking a look at today. I gotta say though, I am surprised they didn't have it use a PlayStation Move controller, as that's kind of the theme here with the peripherals. But whatever, that's besides the point. Let's just be glad there is a normal version. The first thing worth mentioning about this game is its story. Unlike its predecessor, which covered the original story of the movie it was based on with a lot of extra subplots on the side, for padding, this game does not at all go over the story it's based on, not even a little bit. It actually starts off with the ending of the second movie, technically making this the original Kung Fu Panda 3, with Shen already being defeated and his goons resurfacing, and well, that's kind of it. I don't really know. It's just Po and the Furious 5 beating up Shen's leftover goons, I guess. That's the entire story. To be fair, it does include side characters introduced in the second movie, like the Ox and Crocodile Master dudes, but that's about it, really. I mean, to be fair, this is a very normal thing for movie tie-in games to do. I have covered two in the past that have acted like sequels to the movies they were based on. But in this case, it's truly disappointing, as Kung Fu Panda 2 is, in my opinion, the best Kung Fu Panda film. I get it's far more story-driven, and action scenes are few and far in between compared to the first movie, but I really would have enjoyed a final boss fight with Shen based on that one from the movie on the ship, if you remember what I'm talking about. Kind of like what we got with the Tai Lung fight in the original Kung Fu Panda movie game. But instead, we get this weak filler plot about Po chasing down and beating up some fodders. But hey, it's whatever. It's a movie tie-in game. If you want a good story, just watch the movie. Now focusing on the game itself, I do have to say the presentation is just downright dog shit at times. Like, what are these character models, man? That is the stuff of nightmares. Though, to be fair, for movie tie-in standards, it's really not that bad. I mean, this is a PS3 game, and it looks worse than the PS2 port of its predecessor, but that's besides the point. I mean, to start, the graphics definitely don't really matter here. They're not horrible. They don't dumb down the game at all, really. But I will say it's definitely bad for sequel standards, considering its predecessor is honestly a very good looking game, especially for movie tie-in standards. But on its own, as a movie tie-in game, it's fine enough. There's nothing horrible here. But yeah, there's really no point in this game where I can say an environment looks nice or anything, as it all takes place on one fixed camera angle, because unlike the predecessor, which was an action platformer, this is just an action game, without the platformer, otherwise known as a glorified beat-em-up. Except not really glorified. And I just want to say, the gameplay itself, which is absolutely, by the way, designed around bare-bones story combat, is completely barren and baby basic. You are given no combos at all in this game, only light attacks and strong attacks, and 3 special moves you learn by progressing, which all feel super clunky by the way. Progression is completely built around this boring combat system as well. It's literally just a button masher, and I don't mean fun Dynasty Warrior game button masher, where you're given all these fun combos you can use, but more so you have like 2 attacks and that's it. For the entire game, by the way. Going back to the first Kung Fu Panda movie game, which had a good enough combat system, one that at least made fighting feel fun and somewhat open-ended, this is just downright disappointing. And you want to know what's worse? The game doesn't even run well. Frame rate and performance are 2 things I always overlook, as 30 to 60 frames per second is practically the same to me. Good enough, in most cases. But here, oh god, you'd be lucky to get a stable 20. It's one thing to be a super boring, a very empty, and just a downright inferior sequel, but to not even run well is a hell of its own. I mean, there's points in this game where it was running at like 5 frames per second because too many enemies were on screen. There's other issues I could get into, like the lack of polish in cutscenes, the awful sound mixing, but I'd rather not even go there, as it's also nice to see the good in things too. In this game's case, I will say I really enjoyed the boss fights this time around. They feel structured, even if simple, and they don't rely on button mashing. They're actually fun to get through, so massive props to that, I guess. And although this game's story and new characters were honestly pretty horrible, I did enjoy some of the cutscenes, especially the ones with the Crocodile Master dude, as I found them kind of enjoyable and funny.
What's he doing? He's sneaking around. He's not very good at it. Master Croc must know he's there. I think he's lost in meditation. It happens.
And you know, for as unpolished as this game may look, it plays just fine, other than some frame rate issues. And it's hard to call it extremely boring when the combat is at least functional and doesn't even feel like a drag to get through. Enemies die fast enough, it feels kind of fluid to use, even if it's pretty cookie cutter and basic. But aside from that, there's nothing more I could possibly say about this game. It ironically clocks in around the same time as its predecessor at around the 3-hour mark, but it genuinely doesn't feel as fulfilling of an experience as it lacks variety, a story, a good combat system that actually feels like fun to use and engaging. And like many movie tie-in games, it's stuck with that mediocre polish. I mean, it works, I guess, but that's the farthest I could go with that. And it's not to mention that this game has like no replay value at all. Not that you would really want to replay a game like this anyways, but it does have achievements and trophies if you're into that thing, offering one of the easiest platinum trophies of all time. But that's besides the point. But with all that being said, all I can ask is why? Why did this game have to end up being so cookie cutter, so barren, so empty? Why did it have to get to this point when its predecessor was one of the best of all times in its category? If this was just any movie tie-in game, I would not be making this video, but this is a sequel to one of the best movie tie-in games of all time, and I mean literally. So why did we have to go from hero to zero? Well, the answer's simple, and it's not one you may expect. It's not just, oh, different developers, oh, movie tie-in game, but rather because this game was nothing more than a marketing deploy. Aside from the DS version, which is its own thing entirely, this game was made solely to promote 2 products that were in desperate need of promotional material during this time. The Kinect and the U-Draw tablet. More so the Kinect, though, if we're being honest. The U-Draw tablet version of this game, from what I've heard, is played through using the stylus controls, which may explain why they dumbed down the combat to be super simple, and this is especially amplified because the Kinect version of this game uses your actual movements to be played. Like entirely. So it's easy to see why they had to cook this game down to 2 moves with some specials. As for the lack of a real story or polish, well, that's just because it's a Kinect game. It can only be so long. Using real movements is tiring, so switching up gameplay variety, adding diverse combos, and dragging on a decent story for 5 or 6 hours would make this an absolute slog to get through, and it would just cost too much for what it's worth. It's a Kinect game. It's not even a real video game. It's very clear this game was just scrapped together as an excuse to sell tickets and useless peripherals that would die in less than 3 years. That's just a sad fate of the PS3 version, which is the exact same as these other ports, but without a gimmick per se. I have a theory that maybe they were going to use a PlayStation Move controller, kind of like the Kinect, but later in development they were just like, oh, we don't want to do that, let's just give it button controls. So it just adopts these useless button controls, making for a very barren and empty experience. Now, as for the game's awful frame rate issues, I'm not sure if it runs like dog shit on the other editions, but as far as I know, the PS3 is just notorious for having slow running ports, so overall, this game isn't even terrible. It's not one of the worst I've ever played. I could even see an excuse as to why it's not bad. It's probably one of the most empty games I've ever played. It's very typical, kind of inoffensive, aside from a few mishaps, but overall, it's just honestly extremely disappointing. Although it may only fail a little bit as a game, it completely fails as a sequel to one of the best movie tie-in games ever made. The Fall was definitely a disappointing one to see. I was hoping for an equally good adaptation for the best movie in the franchise, but hey, it's a movie tie-in game. What are you gonna do? We've seen worse, let's be honest. All I do know is that I still have one more game in this trilogy to cover, and you may notice by the title, this won't be quite the same as the others, so I totally look forward to it. Or, I guess after this game, I shouldn't. But, hey, there's no Kinect or U-Draw tablet, so it should be fine.
What you say about the Kinect? I love the Kinect!